Right, so today I'm going to talk about Judaism. It is such a vast religion, so this is just barely scratching the surface, but for the sake of keeping this video nice and concise, I'm going to go over some of the main concepts and the idea of the relationship human beings have with God, the afterlife, the notion of Jewish mysticism, and some of the other kind of main components of the religion. So the main kind of underlying umbrella purpose here with respect to Judaism is that we are thinking about the historical and spiritual relationship that human beings have with God. So that idea that human beings have a covenant with God, they have an agreement with God, and human beings basically have to fulfill this covenant, they have to fulfill this agreement, and that Jewish individuals have been chosen by God to establish this covenant with Him. So Jewish individuals are viewed as the chosen individuals or the chosen people. And it's a contractual agreement that they have with God. Specifically, the covenant is between, in Judaism, the covenant is between God and the people of Israel, the Israelites. So who is God, or what is God? God is basically monotheistic. So there is a belief in one God, and God has established morality for everyone. So ethical monotheism is a principle of Judaism. So God has established what is right and what is wrong, basically the moral code and the laws for individuals. So God is viewed as good, God is benevolent, God is also all-powerful, all-knowing, just like with many other religions. God is also transcendent, so God has the ability to transcend or go beyond this world, the secular life. God is beyond space and time, but God still can be everywhere where human beings are. So human beings can still be connected to God. So God still responds to human goodness and kind of acts of benevolence. So how do we deal with the issue of evil then? Because I think that is a really kind of challenging notion here with respect to believing in God. And so there have been different responses to the idea of evil in Judaism. And some theorists have believed that people have sinned against God, so they are basically being punished for it. They're basically being punished for His covenant and rejecting Him and violating this agreement. So He's punishing the individuals who have rejected Him. But of course, the inevitable question with Judaism that comes up is, well, how could God allow such a terrible atrocity such as the Holocaust to occur? How do you still believe that God is good when these terrible things happen? And a response to that can just basically be that, well, then there is no God, or God is not completely good to allow such things to happen. Another response could be that, well, God conceals Himself. So we may not be able to really understand the acts of God or how God works as human beings. So like I said, a lot of debate, different reactions. And I think with Judaism, perhaps more so than Christianity, there is more of a pluralism when it comes to God and the afterlife and how human beings and the soul and how human beings kind of respond to God. So that's the idea of how evil can exist, even though God is theoretically all good. Also, God teaches through divine revelation. So how can God's kind of ethical teachings be transcribed to the people? Well, through divine revelation. So through people experiencing His teachings, through various practices and through various texts. So you have the Torah, which is basically the Hebrew Bible. This is where Jewish law is established, God's revelation is established, what God has revealed is established. And then you have the Talmud, which is these folkloric writings about the history of Jewish individuals and also more about God's revelation. And then you have the mitzvot, which are the 10 commandments, the famous 10 commandments about how we should live and what we shouldn't be doing. So the 10 commandments basically preach for us as human beings to engage in good deeds and to practice goodwill, to be benevolent towards other humans, and pretty much the basic idea of like what is right and what is wrong when it comes to morality. Now, the state of Israel is obviously a contentious issue, but it was established politically in 1948. But religiously, theoretically, the state of Israel is meant to be kind of the holy nation where people can serve and embody God's purpose. So this is supposed to be a space for that to happen. Israel is supposed to be a space for that to happen. And who deserves to be in Israel, right? Who is Jewish? Well, it's basically through the idea of people having these ancestral connections and through the idea of conversion. So those are the individuals who deserve, who are basically the chosen people who ought to be in Israel according to this idea. But clearly, you know, the sociopolitical realities of that complicate the issue. And so there were Palestinians living there for a long time before 1948 and who are still living there. But it's a very controversial issue for both sides. There are some Jewish individuals who don't believe that Israel should be solely given to Jewish individuals, and then there are some Jewish individuals who do believe in Zionism and the belief that the state of Israel kind of belongs to Jewish people. So it really is a political issue more so than a religious issue, but that's kind of some of the religious background for the state of Israel. Now, clearly, one of the major questions in religion is the afterlife. What happens when we die? And there's been kind of debate about that as well in Judaism. So we have the potential to be resurrected, but our souls go to the underworld, or not the underworld, but the afterworld, basically when we die. So in terms of what happens to our souls in the afterworld, we don't necessarily know completely what could happen, but there is a possibility for the immortality of the soul. And the body obviously dies, but the soul kind of persists, which is a very common idea in many religions. And some interesting kind of different aspects of Judaism are reflected in Jewish mysticism, so more of a spiritual form of Judaism, and this idea that Ezekiel had these mysterious visions of God, and so how can we experience God? How can we have these visions of God? So we can't have these visions of God through ecstatic meditation, just very kind of focused meditation that is a very transcendent and spiritual experience, but it's elusive. So it's not very clear how one can experience God. And if one does experience God, it's not going to be the same for everyone. There is probably the most famous Kabbalistic school is a part of Jewish mysticism, where there is this idea of there's a focus on how the world was created and how there's so much mystery associated with how the world was created and how God created the world. But the Kabbalistic school is focusing on how the world was created, which is a fascinating concept to think about. But they want to basically heal the world from evil. And they believe that there's good and evil in all of us. So that's kind of just a little portrait of the Kabbalistic school of Jewish mysticism. And you also have heard of Hasidic Judaism, which is basically a social movement focusing on one's relationship with God and asceticism, so a lot of self-control, really living a disciplined lifestyle, really thinking about how one can have spiritual communion with God, but also be a model for other people. So how can one's actions be a role model of ethics and morality for people? So they're really focusing on having this intimate connection and relationship with God while also being a role model. Another important component to think about with Judaism is the Jewish diaspora. So basically the exile of the Israelites and how they've basically been absorbed into conquering empires and a long time ago, but also even still today, just how Jewish individuals still have kept practicing and believing in their covenant with God and not necessarily kind of assimilating or believing in the ideas of the empires that have absorbed them. So clearly there is tension between Judaism and Christianity over a lot of ideas, being covenant with God, the soul, how one should just practice one's religion in general. And obviously this disagreement hasn't been resolved, but I think it's important to think about, especially because we're also exploring Christianity in this course.